Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Asia HR Women Club. My name is Rita Choi. I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm the founder of Asia HR Women Club. Apparently, there is a club for HR women in Asia, but we also welcome men. We also welcome male, and because we really have the objective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we can see the benefits of fostering an inclusive culture in an organization. And I've been a human resources professional for over 25 years. And the purpose of this club is to promote DEI. And for today, we are so glad that we have Emery Fong, who's going to share some of his insight in this area. DEI Explained Human Resources Edition. Let me give a brief introduction of Emery. Emery is the founder of Awkward Conversations, a Hong Kong-based diversity, equity, inclusion consultancy firm inspired by his own transition story. Emery delivers through light-hearted stories, workshops, and tailored DEI strategy for Asia that brings about real change. Awkward Conversations help forward-thinking corporations to navigate difficult conversations in the workplace. The goal is to create cultures that truly embrace every voice, empowering teams and societies to thrive, not just to survive. In addition, he is a TEDx speaker, volunteers at Gay Games Hong Kong, podcast host of the Awkward Turtle Network. The podcast invites amazing humans who embody the values of DEI to share their unconventional career stories. Before we start the session today, the presentation today, basically we would love you to write your questions in the chat box, and all the questions we answer in the Q&A session. Emery is going to deliver a presentation. Without further ado, let's welcome Emery.
Thank you so much, Rita. Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I know it's going to be a busy week coming up with Easter coming up, so really appreciate your time. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone should be able to see my deck right now. And like Rita said, feel free to write anything in the chat. I think whilst we're just doing some intros and kind of getting maybe a few more minutes before everyone gets in the room, I'd love to hear everyone's story in the chat. Just share, where you're from. I understand this group could be Asia-wide, so we'd like to know where you're from, where you're based, what's your story in joining DEI and why you're here today. Just kind of get to know the room a bit more, and hopefully what you put down in the chat, I'm able to answer throughout the presentation. And if I don't, of course, I'll leave some time at the end to do some Q&A. Because I'm on full screen, I've lost the ability to chat on the chat box, but I'll come back to them when there's anything on there. So I think we can probably get into the presentation. So hopefully today, what I aim to do is 3 key takeaways. One, you would have seen on the poster, is to talk about what is, first of all, DEI, and how does it actually align with the Asian value. A lot of times I think when we hear the buzzword DEI, the word DEI, often we use a lot of Western references or Western material or Western values. Usually there's perception that the West is a bit more advanced in a DEI topic. But I'd love to debunk that myth and talk about how it actually relates to the Asian value a lot closer than what we think as well. Secondly, the key takeaway would be looking at why. What's in it for me? I think the business case is probably quite clear at this point, but from an individual level, why do I need to do it, and what's really in it for me from a very, very much individual level. And then finally, the how. A lot of people in this chat today would be sitting in a HR function, so how do we have, what are the DEI opportunities across each of the sub-functions? And it could be surprising, could be not, but there's so many opportunities that we can tap into as well. So that's the 3 main points I want to talk about today. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, any questions we're welcome to talk about as well. So a bit about me before we get started. So as Rita would have said in the intro, I founded a company called Awkward Conversations, which is a DEI consultancy based in Hong Kong. Now, the reason why it's called Awkward Conversation is very much inspired from my own transition story. So In 2019, I decided to get a major big change in my life to go through the start of my medical transition. For those of you who might not know what that means or might not be familiar with what that means, is that I'm trans man, so I'm transgender, and before 2019 I've always been pretty much the same person. The way I dress, the way I behaved, everything I did is quite similar today. But of course there was something that was still, I guess, not my external appearance was not quite aligning up to my gender identity. So I took a choice to go through a next step, which is medical transition. So what that typically would involve would be things like, the hormones that I think we talk about a lot, as well you will hear a lot in the mainstream media. And what that really meant, and why that was a big point, a kind of key timeline, is because when you take hormones, a few things start to change, especially when it comes to your voice, a few of your appearances. So that was a point where I really need to sit down with work and really explain kind of what they should be expecting next, or what I should be expecting next as well, and how that affects in the workplace. So 2019, I spoke to my boss, my manager, and honestly, what I can say is that everyone's been super helpful, very, very supportive in this journey. But I would say it was only very verbal. And what I meant by that is what I mean by that is the support was very much, yes, we're behind you, we're very supportive, but how can we help? And at that time, I was working for a company that was a big MNC. We had a London headquarter firm, and my thinking was, okay, if a London headquarter firm didn't have that, then most likely most firms won't have these things in place. And I worked in a recruitment firm at the time as well. So my role was, if you're not familiar, as a recruiter, it is essentially a sales role. So I do meet a lot of clients, I meet a lot of candidates all day, every day. So I do meet a lot of new people, and I could be working with people who I met 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that poses the question of, okay, if I go through transition, my voice has changed a lot. How do we basically address it in the workplace? And I just realized that from this conversation, or from this kind of process, that no one had any idea what to do. There was no real guidelines or policies, and I understood there was a gap in education. Most people were very, very generous and very supportive, but there was just no guidelines or no, I guess, real knowledge that they were able to use. So that's kind of how I started the company, because I realized there's a huge gap. So because of my background in recruitment, a lot of companies would come back and ask me what my thoughts are when it comes to hiring. How can we be more inclusive in the process? How can we be more inclusive when we're onboarding candidates, for example. So that's kind of how I started. And the reason why it's called Awkward Conversation, you can probably imagine, is that throughout this process, I just had to come up to a lot of people. And often, sometimes those conversations can become quite awkward because the other side of the conversation might not know how to explain or how to react to my story, for example. So yeah, and then since then, I've been very lucky. I was invited to become a TEDx speaker. And then since then, I've been really kind of working on this consultancy and really hoping that I can fill a gap in that knowledge as well, using my lived experiences. Now, I want to make, I guess, a key point that what I believe in, inclusion is the heart of what I do. So it's not just about trans, it's not just about LGBT, it's about inclusion as a whole. So all groups, all kind of different areas I will focus on as well. A few more things. The 3 things that I live by in the work that I do, and hopefully it shows up as well throughout the presentation, is the 3 things, what I call my secret pin. So P stands for progression. Now, I'm not under the illusion of, if I talk to you for an hour, however long, even when I do workshops or even do a project for 6 months, I'm not expecting that everyone who I speak to and everyone I work with will know exactly what all of this means. But what I hope is actually just progression at any rate. So hope that if I speak to you, if you have this interaction with me, the next time you meet someone that's very, very different to you, you're not going to just kind of shut down the conversation. You will still be open to find out more. Secondly, intersectionality. So I don't know if everyone knows what that means in today's group. I'll talk about it a bit more later as well. But essentially, intersectionality is a very, very key point that I live by as well. It just basically means that each person has multiple different identities. So, for example, me, obviously I'm trans, as I mentioned, but I also have ADHD. So I'm also in the neurodivergent community. I'm also Chinese who live abroad, so I was also ethnically a minority at some point in my life. So that, because of these different identities, it actually creates a different, let's say, challenge depending on because of these, across these 3 identities. So The reason why that's so important is because sometimes when we talk about D&I, when we talk about, let's say, transgender community, we often think it's a blanket statement. But even within the trans community, there's different nuances. So for example, I right now is Chinese, someone who's Chinese who speaks the language here, who looks like they're from Hong Kong, and who's trans. The treatment that I get, or generally speaking, I don't have a huge amount of challenge on everyday kind of life, at workplace as well. But what if I was someone who was trans, who was black, who doesn't speak any Cantonese, living in Hong Kong? That would make a very, very different scenario, and therefore your experience would be very, very different as well. So intersectionality just recognizes that every single person, just because they belong to one group, doesn't mean that's the only group they may belong to. Now finally, non-binary. So non-binary, you might hear this word very much in the LGBT context, or in the sexuality context, or gender identity. But what I mean by that is non-binary thinking. So, we live in a world where it's very much binary by design. We're taught that what is true, therefore what isn't true must be false. But in reality, as adults, we know most things have grey areas. So we really have to adopt a non-binary thinking to make sure we leave room for new possibilities. And I think the basis of what D&I is, for you to practice it well, you have to have this non-binary thinking that you always are open up for new ideas or new scenario, new situations. So hopefully that kind of goes through today's session as well. Now, just two small ground rules. Today, I know this is recorded, but I think this will still be quite a safe space. Any questions or any comments, feel free to put it in the chat. There is absolutely no right or wrong answers. Even though you're not sure, please feel free to still have your input and your comment, because I think I'd rather have that conversation than not. Secondly, this is a two-way conversation, so your engagement is highly appreciated. So please keep it flowing and help me out as well a little bit. Okay, so we always chat about intro, about myself, what I do, but what exactly is D&I? I would love to hear your thoughts as well about what you think D&I is. There are so many different definitions now, so many different ways of explaining it. What I like to explain it is, the way I like to explain it is in this following thing. So on the screen you'll see diversity, the way I see it, is a fact. A lot of the times we talk about, or a lot of times companies talk about increasing diversity, or how do we make sure we have more diversity. But sometimes I want to challenge that thought, because how can we increase diversity when everyone can be diverse? It's actually the most important thing. The more important thing is about including diversity. And I'll speak to that a bit more in a sec. But diversity to me is a fact. Every one of us is diverse in our own ways. You cannot look at one group and determine just by looking at them, by saying this is a diverse group or this is not a diverse group. We all have our little things. People could we can have people with disability in the group. Sometimes it might not be visible, sometimes it might be visible. Same as being LGBT. Sometimes it can be more apparent, but sometimes it doesn't have to be. So diversity is always a fact. It's always all around us. Even not just talking about these so-called groups, even personality, habits, all of that is all within us. Each human is diverse. So that's just a fact for myself. Now, equity is an interesting one. So I think we probably hear a lot about equality, but there's a reason why equity is what we strive for. Equity is a system. The way I see it is the how. Is what do we actually do? What do we have in place to ensure we have diversity and ensure we have inclusion? And that takes me on to inclusion then. So inclusion merely is just a practice. It's an action that you are doing to invite someone in. So you're going out of your way to go and invite someone, to make sure you're including someone. And the reason why the three of them kind of go hand in hand, called D&I, is because I believe one cannot work without the other one. So put that into an example. You can have all diversity in your company, but if you don't have equity, and if you don't have the inclusion, then there's no point having diversity. I'd rather you not have the so-called diversity, but you do the inclusion well at first. And you can't have inclusion when there's only one group, so you can't have inclusion when there's no diversity, so on and so forth. So the three of them have to work all together for it to be effective. So I'm a big football fan. You would have heard the intro. I was a volunteer at Gay Games, and I ran the football tournament. And basically, I use a lot of the sports analogy in my work, and hopefully that kind of comes through as well. So when we talk about football, what was the first thing that came to your head? generally speaking, even for someone who works in this space, inclusion space, plays football, my first thought is always the World Cup football. The Premier League, the big kind of, high demand games. But even within football itself can be diverse, because you get outside football, you get outdoor, indoor, 11-a-side, 7-a-side, 5-a-side, 3-a-side. You get men, female, mixed. You get adaptability football as well. So what I mean by that about diversity of fact is that actually everything around us has a diversity element in it. But it's how do we actually stop and think about how diverse that thing is. So football, generally speaking, when we think about football, probably diversity is not the first word you think of it, but if I explain there's so many different types of games within the football, then you start to think, oh, actually football can be diverse as well as a game itself. Now, equity in this sense, in a football sense. So if I say equity, in this sense, let's say for disability football, if I run a football tournament for people with disability, but I don't have the right equipment, I don't have the right pitch, I don't have the right system that puts into place to invite these people, then it doesn't work. So I have to ensure that if I'm going to have a tournament like this, I make sure that I have the right system, the right equipment, the right safety equipment around me. And finally, inclusion. If I have all this bang on correctly, done right, but I don't actually do the action of inviting them to the tournament, then there's no point of actually having the tournament itself. So that's what I mean by the three of the name, the diversity, equity, and inclusion has to come together for it to work effectively. So hopefully that paints you a bit of a light about what diversity, what I mean by is a fact. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about equality and equity. As I mentioned just now, equality is sort of what we are often hearing, and it's very easy to understand. But these two photos or diagrams really explains the differences between equality and equity. So let's take the left, for example. I think equality, it sounds great, right? The equality means that everyone's treated in the exact same way regardless of differences. I don't care who you are, I'll give you the same treatment. But as you can see quite clearly on that diagram, it doesn't actually make sense. It sounds great, it's probably a great concept, a great idea to work towards. For me, it's maybe perhaps the very much end goal, but right now we must work with equity first. So if it was a wheelchair bound person, and if I gave them the exact same bicycle as everyone else, it's not going to be effective or helpful for anyone, right? Same thing with the height. If you have a same bike size for someone who's taller, someone who's shorter, whatever, or for a child, it's not going to make sense. It's not going to be working. So why equity is so important is because equity means everyone is provided with what they need to succeed. And sometimes that might look differently. So essentially what equity means is that we recognize the differences. We're not downplaying the differences. We're actually recognizing it more and highlighting more. So because everyone's so different, how can we make sure that we are able to provide what they need, the tools they need for them to be successful? So for example, in this instance again, for a wheelchair bound person, can we give them something that can be used by hand? If we have someone who's taller, let's give them a bigger bike. Someone who's relatively shorter, a smaller bike, and then at the end here, a bike size that obviously fits for a kid. Same thing over here. Again, equality sounds great on paper, but if we give everyone the same thing, again, it's not effective. So we have to recognize that there are differences and there are nuances. So equity basically takes into the fact that everyone is different and we need different things all the time for us to succeed. And that's, for me, is a key to all of this. Equality, again, is ideal and it sounds great, but we must recognize differences. A lot of the times, I think the thing that we hear is that, oh, I don't see color, I don't see gender, I don't see, anything. But actually, if anything, that's actually a worse statement because you're not celebrating the differences. You're not recognizing that we are different, that we all have our differences that makes us unique. And I think equity, the reason why equity is so much, I guess, more practical, in my words, in my perspective, more helpful, is because we are recognizing that. We're not trying to downplay anyone. Now, on the business case, why does DEI make so much sense? It is, for me, it's a no-brainer. First of all, the basis of DEI, if you break it all down, it's all about community, it's all about teamwork and harmony, right? By making a company have an inclusive mindset, an inclusive culture, by having different people in your team, by having that effective DEI, what we mentioned earlier, it basically will foster a lot of different conversations. that otherwise would not happen. So then you are basically practicing teamwork. You're making sure everyone is able to work as a collective rather than individuals. Secondly, because you're having these conversations that otherwise would not happen, you are always given new ideas, new innovation, little ways to pivot your businesses. And what that basically does, it actually is giving you more of a long-term thinking, because you always open up to new ideas, you always open up to new ways of working, new ways of thinking. In a sense, you're also future-proofing your business. And the very easy example is actually employing different age groups. So you get different perspective from a generation point of view. So then your business is always constantly on the ground, understanding what's the pulse in the market, what's the pulse in your community, what are they thinking, what they're expecting in your products, what's the feedback from the business, how can we do better? And for you to do that is actually making sure you have that inclusive mindset in the company, that culture, all the way down from the top, all the way to the bottom, not just a HR department thing, it's not just a management point thing, it's everyone has to do it for it to work. And if you do it well, then these are the three kind of big, benefits you get as well. So what does effective D&I actually looks like, right? So I always go to the bottom. So first of all, it has to come from a leadership. Leadership commitment has to be a very, very key critical point. They have to be visibly supporting it. They have to be talking about it all the time. And the way you talk about it, it shouldn't be at the end of the town hall and go, by the way, we are very much in about D&I. You know, if you leave it to the end, it tells people a lot about the priority you're setting about what D&I means at your company. So you should be looking at the start of the town hall. We mention these things, we talk about these things, what we're doing from a corporate level that makes sure our workplace is inclusive. And then we talk about policies. Are we constantly looking at policies in our company? Are we reviewing them constantly to see, okay, what are the gaps that we have at the moment that lacks equity and that actually have policies that might potentially accidentally excluding some groups. So how can we look at that from a company infrastructure point of view? We make sure we're including everyone. And then that really basically is all about trust building. If you have all of this right, you will have a base level around of trust from your employees, and hopefully that will extend and translate and transmit to the market you're doing business with as well. And then for you to do that well, it's actually listening to what your community wants, your employee wants. You know, are you creating that environment where people can give you feedback? And if so, when they give feedback, is that being actioned? Is that being done well? Is that being addressed correctly and appropriately? And apart from this internal point of view, you also need to listen to your customers. So are you listening to your customers who could be from this community that we're talking about? What are their needs and their wants? How can you make your product or your business or your service more catered or more inclusive to your community? So a lot of it is about listening to what is needed from an internal point of view as well as external, and then how can we back that all up in our policies, in our corporate strategy overall. Essentially embedding it to the business plans. So that's what I call the foundation, the roots of all of it. And if you do that well, then you will be able to have, let's say, this BRG's resource groups. So some companies call it BRG's, business resource groups. Some call them ERG's, employee resource groups. Some can be just a simply D&I committee. So essentially these are affinity groups. So once you're able to have these kind of solid foundations, you are able to have that funnel of information from internal and external, then you should be able to set up these BRGs or affinity groups that also will then help you to execute these kind of needs and wants from the community, from the markets. And for it to go to the next step further is to have the ability to have accountability. So what happens if we don't do these things? You know, what happens next? What happens to the leaders? What happens to the managers if they're not cultivating an inclusive workplace? What's the basically what happens when we fail at this? Is there anything being addressed? Does that affect their performance reviews? How does it look? What does it look like? And then we need to have a strategy and vision. You know, without knowing where we're going, it's very, very hard to keep on track. And that's very much a basic kind of business strategy, that we always need to have a vision and strategy. What do you want your company to look like in this context? Do you want it to be an inclusive environment or exclusive environment? And if so, how do we do that? We also need to make sure that we have these initiatives in place, that we're also recording the matrix, what works, what doesn't, because there's no one size fits all. The beautiful thing, and sometimes really hard thing to do, and I think the reason why people like me work in this space, because sometimes it can look so complex across different companies, different people, different leadership style, because it's all very diverse, right? So there's no one size fits all. So we have to keep kind of basically trying, doing trial and errors, recording the matrix, and then basically using that proof, what works, use that as a proof to win any resistance going forward down the line. That's the middle part. And what kind of complements it well as well is that ongoing training, looking at talent development, looking at inclusive leadership. How do we integrate all of this stuff in terms when it comes to the business itself? So how do we integrate all of this ideas and mindsets into the business? And then the result you get is safe spaces, representation across the board, across all levels of your employees, visibility across, again, all levels. And then you get a really great employee engagement, you get a sense of belonging, you get productivity, you get innovation. And what that also does from an external point of view is that you attract a top talent, you get more loyal customers, and you really enhance your branding as well. And there's so much research that we probably won't have time to get in today, but there's so much research that shows all of this actually is a result of effective D&I. So having an effective D&I strategy has a direct impact to profit and loss. So I won't read through all of that, but essentially there's just so much research. McKinsey's done it, Deloitte's done it, that basically it just gives you a financial advantage as well if you do D&I well in your company. So to kind of, I guess, wrap up what D&I is, the idea I think before, or the way it was done before, is that we believe that it's probably a nice to have, it makes us look good, so we're doing the wrong things, we're doing it with wrong intentions, but for the right outcome. But what we want to actually do is D&I is a way to future-proofing your business. It actually helps the business. We have to switch this mindset of that. It's still no longer just a nice to have, it's a good kind of CSR thing to do. But actually, if you do that well, it actually helps your business. It's future-proofing your business further and further. It makes sure that your business is always on the ground, you're always on your toes, you're always pivoting to new ideas and new ways of business. And that's what D&I to me really is, and that's why it's a no-brainer for me to practice D&I effectively in your companies. So I want to have a quick question on what do we think. We are obviously an Asia group. Do we think Asia is behind when it comes to D&I, practicing D&I? If we can get a couple of yes or no's in the chats, or hands up for yes, do you want to put in any chats, or what do we think? Is it a yes or no? Do we think Asia is far behind? Just give a few seconds for everyone to type in their answers. Rita thinks yes. I think Jag says no. Anyone else? So we got another yes as well. Okay, so my answer is going to be annoying. It's going to be a yes and no. And the reason why I think that is because I think the infrastructure of Asia has a really high potential to really practice D&I effectively. But right now, the way we're doing it, probably slightly behind. But there's so much opportunities and there's so much stuff that's already in our culture that actually will really help and drive this D&I practice going forward. And this is what I mean in the following slides. I love that. Depends on the scenario. Overall, society and laws are not backsliding, but corporate approach is less sophisticated. I agree. Not as easy to say yes or no. I think it's becoming more broadly accepted. Absolutely. And one interesting that kind of, I guess, tidbit to that, Charles, is that before, a lot of my clients was always iBanks and law firms. Now, the type of clients I get is becoming a lot more diverse, and it's a lot more consumer-led. So I'm working with hotels, I'm working in retail brands, I'm working with local gyms. They realize that, and then I think people are starting to recognize that, especially consumer-led companies, they need it more. And it makes sense because anyone can walk through the door. It's no longer just a corporate thing. Now it's the customers are demanding it, the general society is also demanding it as well. So let's talk about why do we not prioritize D&I? Even though all of this is talked about a lot of this is being spoken about a lot, it's more broadly accepted, and we generally, when we hear D&I, we generally know what that means. But why is it still not a number one priority? Why are we not doing it well? One, I think it's a misconception. So misconception, I would have addressed this slightly earlier in the beginning of this call, is that the idea or the perception of D&I is very much still comes from the West, right? It's a very global thing. What tends to happen when I first started working in this industry is that the companies who had an MNC presence, who had a headquarter presence in the US or in Europe or in London or wherever it may be, what usually happens is that the headquarter want to practice D&I, and then what usually happens is that, okay, this is what worked well here in Europe or in the US, let's do the same in Asia. And typically Hong Kong or Singapore would be the regional hub. So then we copy and paste what happens there, so over here to Asia, and then we expect the same results. But we keep forgetting about the difference, the nuances that we have over here, right? The demographics different, the understanding, the awareness of what D&I means is very, very different. I think the way it's been packaged, the values of D&I pretty much is probably, if not closer to the Asia values than Western. Now, I'm not saying which one is better, which one's worse. I'm just saying that there are differences and nuances in our culture already that actually will really prepare us to really practice D&I well. So it's a misconception of what this thing is, what D&I is. I think when we talk about D&I, sometimes LGBT is a big conversation that always being had within this space. And there's also an idea, and there's also a myth, there's a belief that LGBT also is a very much Western ideals, a Western lifestyle. But if we look at the history, a lot of the time actually all of this stuff already existed in Asia, especially in places like India. A lot of LGBT, especially for trans and first gender, all of this is already in the culture, in the history books, but we just haven't really kind of recognized it in this sense. So what I love to do is really associate it back to using our own history, using our own culture, and how that links up. D&I or LGBT or anything shouldn't be a culture or nationality thing, right? It should be just about people at first, it's about humans first. So there's one big misconception of what it really actually is. And secondly, I think lack of localized material is a big probably issue. That kind of rises to the back of the misconception, because a lot of the material, a lot of the material or the context that we use is from the West. When we talk about, let's say, reports and research, a lot of them usually are done with the lens of the Western lens as well. So there's more now, but there's still a huge gap in research that looks at specifically the culture of Asia. Let's say, because I'm from Hong Kong, there's not a lot of stuff that talks about Hong Kong specifically in a very much Hong Kong region. Even in Hong Kong, there are nuances as well. So we have to recognize that there are so much material that is at the moment lacking that focuses on localized lens for Asia. So these are the two key reasons why I think we are not able to prioritize D&I or not able to effectively practice it for now. But all of this stuff is slowly starting to change in a very, very much positive direction. And if I go back to the last slide I mentioned just now about why D&I makes a lot of sense, and we talk about it in the Asian context. If you look at it, actually, teamwork, harmony, innovation, long-term thinking, future-proofing, all of this is very much an Asian mindset. So to me, I think Asian mindset and Asian values and D&I values are very much on par and very much aligned. And if you also think about it, even in our everyday lives, let's say eating, for example, right? So we eat in a big table, we typically eat a round table. We often do family-style sharing. We're always sharing our food, we order for the table. So we already actually practice that inclusion piece, that harmony piece. How do we all kind of collectively work together? In Asia, generally speaking, a lot of the belief is that we live in a harmony and we live in a collective. Collective comes first. And that really is the basis of what D&I actually talks about. But what the difference is that we also recognize the differences between each individual, each different groups, and how do we make sure that we live in a harmonious society and the groups, and how do we respect each other? And as you know, respect is a huge thing in the Asian culture. And D&I, again, what it really all talks about is just the basic respect. So I think if we're able to associate that back to our everyday lives, what we already believe in, I think we're in a very, very good place to actually practice D&I really effectively over here. And just some quick inspiration of what I really mean when it's done well. What happens, what does it look like? From a business point of view, what kind of products there is. So I mentioned Gay Games. So Marriott Bonvoy, they were a gold sponsor of Gay Games, and they recognized that we cater to anyone who walks in. We welcome to anyone who walks into a hotel. We also have restaurants and bars that people come to. We have the most diverse customer base. So they were basically putting where the money where the mouth is. They really promoted us for gay games, gave us a platform to really extend, help us to drive a key message home. They also provided people who participate in gay games who travel overseas with discounted rate rooms, and that obviously had a business case for them as well. So I'm not under the illusion of this is just a good thing to have, but there's a huge business case that they also can win as well. Over here, we've got a product that is developed in Hong Kong. Essentially what it does, it actually helps the visually impaired. So it's got a camera in the front, it's a belt, a simple design that you put around your waist. And essentially what it does is that it vibrates. It captures the room where you're walking into, the space you're walking into, and it basically vibrates and alerts the user if they're walking into anything in danger, walking across the road, if they're walking towards a wall. It basically vibrates in a way they understand. And it gives people who have a visually impaired challenge basically the independency. That's the number one challenge that people have, because they're not able to live their life on their own. Often not, they rely on their primary carers, and that actually then takes them away from time from work, etc. So if people have these kind of tools, and it basically helps society and helps themselves into an individual level to live more independently, and therefore able to be more integrated to society as well. HSBC did a really nice ad campaign, I think it would have been a few years ago now, but in the hashtag that basically says, "This is my family portrait." And that basically breaks the stereotype of what we think a family portrait is. So if I ask you a different question, what do you picture when you think of a family portrait? Typically speaking, even for myself, it is, a heterosexual couple with kids, with their grandparents maybe in the photo. But this basically talks about, actually, family doesn't always look like that. This could be a family, this is what a family could look like, the same-sex couple. And from a banking perspective, of course, they want people to open accounts, saving accounts, all that kind of stuff. So again, there's also a business case, and that's how you embed it to the business. And then last two, quickly, this is Fenty Beauty. For those who might not be familiar with that brand, it's basically a brand from Rihanna, the singer, and she came out with this makeup brand that has all these shades for foundations. Now, it sounds very simple, it makes sense, but actually before she put this out, there was a lot of people who couldn't find the right shades for their skin tone in the market. And since she's brought out this range of foundation, now this has now become a standardized product or range of how they execute products in the makeup industry. Again, it's recognizing that there are differences, there's nuances, and it's a very simple little tweak in your product that will cater to the mass. And again, it brings you back revenue. There's a huge business case for it. And this only came out less than a decade ago. So there's still so much opportunities, potential that business can tap into. Last one that I want to talk about is the MasterCard. I don't know who uses MasterCard in this group, but have a look in your card. I've seen it in real life as well. It basically is called a touch card. And what they've done is simply have these rough edges that represents different things. A credit card, debit card, or a prepaid card on your credit card. And what that helps is actually helps again the visually impaired. So number one thing that they find challenging is when they pay for things, they may sometimes not able to distinguish the ID card or any other cards that we all carry. This is a very simple solution. It's very simple technology, but that again also makes a huge difference for someone who wants to live independently. When they're doing simple things, everyday things like paying for coffee, right? That we find perhaps very simple, very easy, but some may find it a bit more challenging. So little tweaks like this in your products can help the masses. And if I was a person with a visually impaired, I would definitely opt for your bank, your credit card, and I would definitely advocate for my friends and my community to join your bank as well. And that's what I mean by practicing DEI when it embeds to your business as well. So in products all the way from internal to external, you have to see it. So now let's talk about what's in it for you. I think you might get the gist of it already throughout the conversation, but really, for me, number one thing is personal growth, right? It really helps you to recognize the way you also behave. right? For myself, my journey of overcoming the challenges or the things that I had internalized transphobia, I learned a lot by myself. When I read about, educated myself on DEI, there was so much stuff that I learned about self-awareness, about why I believe certain things about certain groups, and why I would, let's say, for example, react to certain things in this way, or perceive someone as a higher performer than others. It really challenged myself in terms of the bias that I might have. Now, unconscious bias, I think, is something that we talk about a lot in the realm of DEI as well. I think the one key thing I want to talk about or address about unconscious bias is that we cannot eliminate unconscious bias. That's why it's unconscious. We can't, it's in our DNA. We can't eliminate it. But what we can do is actually just recognize, right, the differences or the biases that we have internally. And then once we recognize it, challenge yourself. Challenge, why do I think this way? And that basically helps you to grow as a person, and it really opens you up to heaps amount of different ideas. And because of that, you're learning. You are learning. You open up to new ideas. You are then obviously getting more out of a job. So it increases your job satisfaction. It helps you to look at different things, look at things differently. It opens you to all these possibilities in the world, in the workplace. And because of that, because if you practice DEI, you might then have the access to actually senior leaders who also advocate for DEI. You might also be able to connect and network with people in different offices in different companies, or even across different industries. And it just helps you and expand your network and have the idea of collaboration. And then lastly, because of all of this stuff, it's simple as it just helps you to have a stronger career advancement, right? It really kind of opens you up to different people, different stories, different ideas, different products, different businesses, and it's just going to equip you even more and more, especially in this nowadays that it's very rare that one person stays in a job for 7, 8, 10 years. And because every company is doing this, if you're looking for a new job, if you're looking to change it for a new job, that you have to understand these mindsets. And the same thing about as a HR, if you're recruiting, that you have to understand all your competitors are practicing this DEI stuff. So you make sure you have this in place as well to make sure you win the best talent. And this is a lovely TED talk that I love to bring your attention to. It talks about basically how, it doesn't talk about DEI per se, but it talks about the acts of what DEI actually, really the values of it. It talks about how actually being respectful to your co-workers has a huge amount of effect, positive effect for those around you as well. So it's not necessarily just about that person receiving it, it also has an effect on the mass as well. So people do recognize it and they see it, and it actually helps you and the business overall. So I really recommend you spend 10-15 minutes to go through that as well. Now, this is the last slide I'll go through it, and we'll go to the Q&A. And this is a HR group, so I want to talk about how each HR sub-function comes into play when it comes to DEI. There is so much more in depth to this, but this is a very high level. It's already quite a lot already. So let's say for my example, actually I'll come back to this in a minute. I'll talk about the first thing, employee branding. So DEI, as I mentioned already, is now pretty much the norm. It's a standardized practice that every company will look at to do. And I would say if you're not practicing it right now, in 10 years time, you will definitely really struggle to stay in business because everyone is doing it. Not just because from an internal perspective, even as I mentioned from a product's perspective, from a service perspective, customers are demanding it. Whether or not you're in a B2B business or B2C, everyone is demanding it. So that actually will give you a huge amount of appeal to the top talent in the market. They recognize what are the best companies to work for, who are the most inclusive companies to work for, and they will opt for that brand to work for. Diversity, as we've spoken about, it gives you that competitive edge to attract the right talent, different talent as well. And it really differentiates you from the market. Even though, as I mentioned, most firms are doing it right now, but it still gives you that differentiation because each and every one of the companies will be doing it differently. Whether you like it or not, everyone has their own different business cases. So it just differentiates you further from the competition. And then finally, when an employee works well, they enjoy working in your company, they feel that inclusiveness, they feel it belongs to your company, they are natural brand ambassadors. And therefore, they might even give you really strong referrals as well for the market. Now, recruitment. You can look at your inclusive language that you use on the JD, on your job ads. How can you make sure that when you speak to the market, you even have that inclusive language? Do you just write he or she? Do you write certain jobs that are very much gendered? Do you write certain working hours that would be, that could be exclusive to certain groups? Do you take care, or do you have any kind of, let's say, inclusive workplace policies? Work from home, flexible hours working. Do you appeal to the masses, and do you appeal to all different groups that tells them that you are practicing inclusive workplace and inclusive working styles? Are you limiting bias process? So are you accepting blind CVs? It might not be blind CVs as they submit it, but when you present it to your hiring managers, are you blinding your CV so it limits bias? As I mentioned, you can't eliminate bias, but how can we limit it? You can be partnering with diverse organizations that have different networks, to different diverse networks as well. So are you doing that already? Are you making that connection to the market? And when you have a panel interview, or when you're hiring for a role, do you have a committee that is inclusive and has a fair, broad perspective? So you're not just relying on one person's perspective in terms of hiring. Now, C&B, huge amounts of that you can do. How can you limit pay disparities based on identities? How can you make sure there's a diverse range of benefits that addresses diverse groups? So the easy example could be same-sex partners. Do you have any policies for that? Do you have any policies for anyone who's a primary carer or has chronic illnesses who may take more annual leaves than others? How can we make sure we address different diverse groups in your policies? Onboarding, promote D&I. Are you talking about D&I when you're onboarding candidates, when you're onboarding new employees? Are you setting a ton of expectation of what we expect working in this company? Are we facilitating opportunities to connect new hires to diverse groups, to ERGs or anything? Are you providing new hires with resources to what they can look at on the intranet or whatever it may be that you're doing in your company? Are you also encouraging cross-functions interactions to foster that more teamwork collaboration as well? And last couple of ones, L&D. Are you offering D&I trainings at different levels, not just leadership, all the way from associate level, all the way to your very top? Are you instilling inclusive mindsets, embedding that as a way of working, is what we believe in? Are you offering mentorship, sponsorship opportunities as well? And are you communicating clearly about career progressions for all different people? Are you setting the right expectations? Talent management, reviews and update performances, evaluations, the criteria of it. How do you determine what's a successful person, right? What's a good person to have in our management teams? What does that mean for your company? Is that always just because this is what we've always done? Is it a type we've always hired, a type we've always promoted? Is there bias in that? Are we reviewing that constantly? Are we updating that, what that means internally? Basically, we think what a successful employee means and look like, right? So what you need to do for that is to train managers on providing feedback without biases, right? We're monitoring and challenging the potential bias that can occur in promotion. Now, that always will happen, we cannot eliminate it, but again, it's how can we recognize it and challenge that. And the last one is, that should come up, policies. So basically all of this has to be in a formal document. This is probably the easiest win, the lowest hanging fruit, if you like, in a corporate language that you can do straight away. Can you review your policies? Do you have your anti-discrimination, harassment policies in place already? Do you have accommodations and accessibility stuff that will cater to everyone that is able to work in your office? Now, if you're going to hire someone who's wheelchair bound, can this person even come into your office, right? So it's little things like that you need to look at that addresses these gaps that you may have already. It could be talking about the dress code. Is there any gender dress code you already have that could be biased as well? That might be outdated, that we need to constantly update. And all of that needs to be aligned to all the other stuff that we're talking about in the employee branding, C&B, and recruitment, and onboarding, all that levels, all the way, as I mentioned, to the end when it comes to external to your consumers as well. So hopefully that gives you a snapshot of just within HR, there's so much opportunities. Same thing can go with marketing, same can go with sales. There's so many little stuff things that we can work on that has all these little goodies for D&I opportunities. So to wrap up, to summarize, I think D&I, I want to say, is nothing new. But because we've been so focused on really having all the systems in place that we forget the human side of things. We forget that human is so complex. So what I want to take away, hope you take away from this as well, is that I love you guys to kind of put the human back in human resources. Put the human side of things first, recognize that we are very complex, we are very different, there are nuances, and how do we make sure that is reflected in our company when it comes to the policies, the way we work, how we hire, how we promote, all of that stuff has to be embedded to what we do as well. And I guess before we go, I'd love you to scan this QR code and just give me a bit of feedback about anything you found that was insightful, that was helpful, or anything that you felt like I should have touched on but I didn't get a chance to today. That will just help me to make sure I do more tailor-made discussions going forward. And then we've got the last 10 minutes left. I'd love to take any questions if there's any. But questions on the chat, you can message me individually or openly in the chat if you like. That'd be helpful as well. But I'll hand it back to Rita when we're waiting on the questions.
Thank you, Emery. Yeah, would you like to share your LinkedIn code so that for those who would like to connect with you, they will just reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, on my LinkedIn, you can just search my name, Emery Fong. It should come up. There's not that many Emerys, luckily, especially in Asia. So Emery Fong, E-M-E-R-Y. You should be able to find me on your LinkedIn, and I'm happy to chat to you individually as well for a Zoom call, for a chat, or anything that'd be helpful. If you're based in Hong Kong, I'd love to meet you in person.
There is a somebody mentioned, like, I think Beth, right?
At the very top, yes.
Yeah, that's right. I like your diversity and inclusion distinction. It relates to what my company's global DEI leader recently told me about how she inspires to no one feeling like they need to cover or mask and for cisgender to realize that they are part of DEI too.
Absolutely. I think that's a great comment. Thank you, Beth. It is I think allyship is a huge thing that we need to do effectively as well. I think that's often a school of thought that is we only need to care about it if we're in those groups, right? But as you can probably imagine, that's not true, and that's not the way to do it. I think D&I is about everyone. You know, it can't just be because you're in these so-called underrepresented groups that you practice D&I. It should be for everyone, because the result of D&I, if you do it effectively, as we mentioned a few times, it benefits everyone. So allyship, it has to be really, I guess, the forefront of this conversation as well, because I believe if we're able to get people in position of power to also advocate for D&I, then the result we get would be tenfold.
Thank you, Emery. Thank you very much for the session today. We can see a lot of benefits of fostering an inclusive culture, adopting DEI. For a company like SME, right? If we have not started anything, what will be our first step?
Well, I think if any company hasn't started yet, I think the idea, actually, what I will do is actually introduce inclusive leadership as a one thing. The way I like to do it is that I don't like to, let's say, introduce each group. So, I think it's great that people do, let's say, LGBT 101 awareness, and then there's, disability 101, things like that. But I think the challenge sometimes that come with that is because is that if we keep introducing these so-called new groups of challenges from these groups, that people could get overwhelmed. There's a new group we need to understand, there's a new thing that we need to understand. But really, if you break it all down, of course, these groups have their nuances and differences, and there's different challenges that they encounter. But if you break it all down, the idea of it, the concept of it, is about being inclusive, right? So if you don't have that inclusive mindset, that non-binary mindset that I talked about in the beginning, that your leadership is not able to understand what being inclusive means, then there's no point of actually hiring someone to come in to talk about LGBT for 1 hour. There's no point of hiring someone to come in and talk about people with disability for 1 hour, because that doesn't really set any relationship to your company. It's just an extra educational piece it will come across. So what I recommend is actually start with inclusive leadership, get your leadership management team understanding what this means, and not kind of downplaying these groups, but understanding inclusive or practicing inclusion helps everyone. And then once the company understands, has the awareness of what D&I is, and then talk about, okay, we can go a bit more in depth about LGBT, people with disability, ethnic minorities, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We start with inclusive leadership. Thank you, thank you. And I have another question about measurement, right? What gets measured gets managed. So DEI, right? How do we measure its success? Understand that some company would measure its representation. So what would you advise for us to measure its success?
That's a really good question. I think I think we haven't got a perfect answer for it yet. With I think in the industry there are a few matrices that we use, but we haven't gotten to the thing where this is the model you follow, right? And that goes back to D&I in itself. It's so diverse. There's no one answer that will address it. But effectively, from a HR perspective, you can look at the turnover rate. So we have a high turnover rate. Why? It could be there are already hidden stories that people have left the company without knowing it's because of the result of exclusion, right? They might feel like they're not being valued, they do not feel they belong to your company. So turnover rate could be a very high key indicator of how your company runs or the culture of a company, right? And people actually tell you up front in your exit interviews that they're leaving the company for this particular reason. We can look at the promotions, right? Look at your leadership, who actually gets promoted. What was the diversity in that leadership team? There's also things like, let's say we put on a lunch and learn 101 or seminars like this. What's the attendance rate? So it could be quite a number of different things depending on what that strategy you're focusing on.